The Women's Political Council was an organization that had begun in 1946 after just dozens of Black people had been arrested on the buses for segregation purposes. And at that time, the Black woman and the white man were the freest people in the southern states. And we knew that if something hadn't been done by the women, there wouldn't be anything done. And we had sat down and witnessed the arrest and humiliation and the court trials and fines paid of people who just sat down in an empty seat. And so we knew something had to be done. We organized the Women's Council. Within a month's time, we had over 100 members. We organized a second chapter and a third. So we had more than 300 members in that organization. We had members in every elementary, junior high, and senior high school. We had them organized from federal and state and local jobs. Wherever there were more than 10 Blacks employed, we had a member there. And we were organized to the point that we knew that in a matter of hours, we could corral the whole city. It was a spontaneous act from those persons who were not members of the Women's Political Council. But we had worked for at least 3 years getting that thing organized. The night of the evening that Rosa Parks was arrested, Fred Gray called me and told me she was arrested. Somebody gone her bail, but her case would be on Monday. And I, as president of the main body of the Women's Political Council, got on the phone and I called all the officers of the 3 chapters. I called as many of the men who had supported us as possible. And I told them that Rosa Parks had been arrested and she would be tried. They said, "You have the plans, put them into operation." I called every person who was in every school and every place where we had planned to be have somebody at that school or wherever it was at a certain time, that I would be there with materials for them to disseminate. I didn't go to bed that night. I cut those stencils. I ran off 35,000 copies of the little foyer that you have. And I distributed them. I had classes from 8 to 10 at the college. And at 10 o'clock, I had 2 senior students who had agreed to go with me. I took them in my car. The packages were already there. It would take about a half a minute to drive on a school campus. The kid would be there. In just a minute, they would disappear. The ministers were meeting that afternoon or sometime during the day on High Street. They were having the International Ministerial Association meeting. And after we had circulated those 35,000 circulars, then we went by the church. That was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and we took them to the ministers. And it was there that they learned there was to be a boycott. And they agreed to meet at Dr. King's church, Dexter Avenue, that night to decide what should be done about the boycott after the first day. You see, the Women's Council planned it only for Monday. And it was left up to the men to take over after we had forced them really to decide whether or not it had been successful enough to continue and how long it was to be continued. We had just everything in our favor because we distributed the 35,000 copies and most of the people got the message. But there were outlying areas that didn't get it. And one lone Black woman who was so faithful to her white lady, as she called it, went back to work and took one of the circulars to this woman so she would know what the Blacks had planned. When the woman got it, she immediately called the media. And then following that, the television, the radios, and evening newspapers, everybody told those persons whom we had not reached that there would be the boycott. So the die was cast. We thought nature was going to fail us because the latter part of Sunday afternoon, it started clouding. And Sunday night, nobody was slept. Monday morning was very dreary, dark, cloudy, and the threat of rain. And it remained that way practically all day. But thanks be to goodness, very few people rode the bus Monday morning. And all of us were around to see how many got on them. I cut stencils and took them to the college. The fellow who let me in during the night is dead now, John Cannon, but he was in the business department. And we went in and ran those off. And this is the first time that has ever been told. We ran off those copies and we cut them because I had two on a sheet before we left there. And he went back to bed and I went home. And that's where I prepared these materials. But they were, I cut them on my own typewriter, but they were run off in the business office of the college. I took them to school with me in my car after I had talked with every member in the elementary, junior high, and senior high schools to have somebody on the campus, that I would be there at a certain time during the day and deliver them. I taught my classes from 8 to 10. I was free from 10 to 2. And when my 10 o'clock class was over, I took 2 senior students with me, and I had them in my car bundled and ready to be given out. And I would drive to the place of dissemination. A kid would be there to grab them, disappear. And I was on the campus and off or in the front of the place or wherever it was before anybody knew that I was there. I delivered them in my car. Monday night, the ministers held their meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church, and they voted unanimously to continue the boycott. And instead of it lasting one day, as the Women's Council had planned it, it lasted for 13 months. The spirit, the desire, the injustices that had been endured by thousands of people through the years. I think the people were fed up. They had reached the point that they knew there was no return, that they had to do it or die. And that's what kept it going. It was the sheer spirit for freedom, for the feeling of being a man and a woman. Blacks had endured much more, I believe, than any ethnic group could possibly endure, trying to be obedient to the system. And I think they would not have boycotted those buses if they had not, from time to time, met courts, had lawyers to try to defend these people whose only accusation was that they sat down in a seat where the whites had, the seats had been reserved for whites. No reason at all, but for everyone who was arrested, even children arrested and paid fine because they dared to sit in those reserved seats. So I think blacks are certainly cooperative people. I think they are good citizens. I think they abide by the law. Only when they had been driven to the nth degree where they could not take any more were they willing to do what they did. And that boycott was not supported by a few people. It was supported by 52,000 blacks who were the population then at the time that I was here. They were fed up. They had had it. I never reached a point where I was sorry. I reached a point where I was scared. The police broke out my picture window. The man next door trailed them downtown, and Mr. Sellers, who was the police commissioner, asked that man if he wanted to live when he followed the police and told them that they had broken out my window. And when the man said yes, he wanted to live, he said, well, you go home and shut your mouth. They got away with it. They broke my window. And not too long after that, I had a carport. And I had my car, there's a new Chrysler parked under that carport. I never turned my lights on until I went to bed. I sat up there in the dark, and many of the people from the college sat with me because they knew I'd been getting a lot of threatening calls. But that particular night, about 2 weeks after they had broken my picture window, I heard a noise on the side where my car was, and I went and looked out the window in the dark, and there were 2 policemen scattering something on the top of my car, on the hood of the car. I didn't know what it was. I saw them when they went back and got in their car and drove away. The next morning, my car was eaten up with acid. I had holes as large as a dollar all over the top of the car, all over the hood of the motor, on the side of the car. I used to drive until 12 o'clock at night in my car, and many times there were white women driving, going to the parking lot. You know about the parking lot downtown where it served as an interchange for different directions, and those women would drive and pick those people up. Now, at one time, when I would get up maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning and start driving, that I would run into whites with blacks, and I thought they were picking up their maids or those persons who were working for them. But it turned out that they were there helping those people to get where they were going. So I would have to say that there were many sympathetic whites who knew that the system was wrong and they were doing what they could to help to correct it. Many people lost their jobs during that 13 months period because it had aroused the antagonism of the white community, those who were not sympathetic toward the cause. And for those who lost their jobs, there were the rest of us who had to help them. The Montgomery Improvement Association was organized shortly after that, and every Monday night we held meetings. They would take up collection for those persons who didn't have jobs to help them to get along. There's one thing I can say, that when the buses were finally put out of business and the bus drivers were out of work, they were employed as policemen. So they had a continuation of income. And many of those policemen would give just hundreds and hundreds of tickets every day to people who were not violating any traffic laws, but they were doing it to help to raise the salaries that they had lost. The bus company had completely been put out of business. There was no transportation at all for anybody, white or black. And the whites constituted about 1/3 of the riders anyway. Half of them had stopped riding before many weeks after the beginning of the bus boycott because out of sympathy for them. And then the others were afraid to ride because they didn't know what might happen to them. So the bus company closed down. They were completely out of work. And that's why those drivers were employed as police people. Now, when you ask why the courts had to come in, they had to come in. You get 52,000 people in the streets and nobody is showing any fear. Something had to give. And so the Supreme Court had to rule that the segregation was not the way of life. During the entire 13 months, I was a member of that board that constituted half white and black, to mediate. We met weekly, and I don't know the exact moment when the news came through, but we anticipated it any time and had expected it much sooner than it came. I was very closely associated with Fred Gray, the attorney, and we kept in almost weekly contact to keep me posted so I could keep the Women's Political Council informed. We did meet after the news came through, and all of these people who had walked for 13 months got together to communicate and to rejoice and to share that build up emotion and all of the other feelings that they had lived with during the past 13 months. And we just rejoiced together. The outcome of the Monday night meeting after the first day of boycotting, they had agreed at the Friday night meeting at Dexter, Dr. King's church, that they would call this meeting at Holt Street because it was the largest church in the city and could accommodate more people. And they would let the audience determine whether or not they would continue the bus boycott or end it in one day. The church itself holds 4,000 or 5,000 people, but there were thousands of people outside of the church that night, and they had to put loudspeakers so they would know what was happening. When they got through reporting that very few people had ridden the bus, that the boycott was really a success, overwhelmingly, I don't know if there was one vote that said, no, don't continue. The people wanted to continue that boycott. They had been touched by the persecution, the humiliation that many of them had endured on buses, and they voted for it unanimously. And that meant thousands of people. Well, let me mention one more thing. At that meeting, they had every medium there, radio or television, newspaper, all over the place with the lights flashing, and nobody cared whether they were there or not when they voted to continue that bus boycott. And of course, the next morning, the papers blazed away, and way into the night, the television and radio blasted away that blacks were going to continue the bus boycott. And so the meeting was met with great thanksgiving that it had started. At first, I don't think they were thinking about the people around the world. I really think they were thinking about themselves, because you had to be in Montgomery to know what they had suffered and endured. And many of the things that I have in my manuscript that I hope someday you will find an opportunity to tell about. The suffering was immense. It had touched the homes of thousands of people through the last 10 years of Alabama State. Virginia Durr and Attorney Durr were lifesavers to us because we had no money. And Attorney Durr helped us with the legal matters. He helped Fred Gray with the legal matters. E.D. Nixon was one of the few black men who was not afraid in Montgomery. When I went to Alabama State in 49, E.D. Nixon had an organization, and it tried, but there were very few people who worked with him for various reasons, of which I cannot to state. But his organization, though he protested individually, it didn't have too much power behind it because it was small in number. Mr. Lewis also had an organization, the Citizens Council, but the following was not great enough to be of too much of a threat. Ralph Abernathy was Dr. King's image. He worked with Dr. King, and they worked together as a team. He really didn't come into his own until after Dr. King died. The only thing I can say to describe Dr. King is that he was dynamite. He was one of the most intellectually trained people I have ever talked with in my life. His background was profound. His faith in himself, his spirituality went far beyond the average person. He had great faith in himself. He had great faith in the people. And when they asked him at that meeting at Holt Street that Monday night if he would be willing to serve as president, at first he hinged because he was just out of graduate school, and he admitted that he just didn't know what it was all about. But they insisted upon him, and he took it. And you know for yourselves during the 13 months and since then that Martin Luther King was one of the few men who could have done what we were able to do in Montgomery. Today, Montgomery is completely void of segregation, although the Ku Klux Klan marched from Selma into Montgomery 2 weeks ago. I know you read about it and all over the country. But any hotel, any eating establishment, anywhere blacks want to go, they can go. Whereas before, we couldn't go even into a public park. Blacks didn't even have a swimming pool anywhere in the city, and they constituted 52% of 123,000 people. There was no public swimming pool for them. It meant that blacks feel like human beings now. They feel like citizens. Life now is worth living. Montgomery today is an integrated community. Everything that was bought for the Negro in 1955 has been opened up to Black Americans. They go into the parks, they go to the hotel, they go to any recreation establishment, they can go to any restaurant. There is nothing here now that is not opened to them. Legally, they cannot be barred from any place in Montgomery. I talked to one or two of the people this morning when I came in that legally and within the law, they cannot segregate anything or anybody. And they could not arrest and put anybody in jail for it. Now, maybe, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan marched in. I mentioned that. Just to say that they were fighting for white power, but that white power means nothing now. We won. We felt that we were citizens. This is not a part of the bus boycott, but right after that, when we won the integration of the buses, we started right back with the sit-ins and the stand-ins that opened up all of these segregated stations, train and plane and that kind of thing. And nobody ever talks about that, but that was a continuation of that bus boycott. We integrated the buses, and then you remember that Montgomery started stand-ins, going into places where they were not served and demanding to be served. We had won self-respect. We had won a feeling that we had achieved, had accomplished. We felt that we were somebody, that somebody had to listen to us, that we had forced the white man to give what we knew was a part of our own citizenship. And so we had won that. And if you have never had the feeling to feel that this is not the other man's country and you are an alien in it, but that this is your country too, then you don't know what I'm talking about. But it is a hilarious feeling that just goes all over you, that makes you feel that America is a great country and we're going to do more to make it greater.